I will, without further ado, jump into the discussion, and I will reserve my comments till after all the panelists have spoken. So let me call upon each of the panelists to share their thoughts in just about 5 minutes. This is a short session, so I want to leave some time for discussion or questions from the floor. So let me turn first to Dr. Uday Prakash. You already heard about him, got the introduction. You're a practicing surgeon in a reputed hospital. And so can you share how AI and digital technologies are actually being used currently? And what are some of the trends and issues that you see from your perspective?
I should be talking about, but I think as a user, end user, it's been a tremendous change over the last 2 or 3 decades since I've been practicing, from direct patient-to-patient, doctor-to-patient relationship to a more informed patient these days. And because of the access to technology and AI and information that is there. And I think that has pluses and minuses. Plus is that the patient is already well informed about what they have, but quite often you come across situations where the patient actually is not informed, is misinformed, and it's because it's the, you are talking to a computer. There is a context that the computer doesn't see. There's a human being in front of it, ranting their symptoms into a computer, and is churning out data which may or may not make sense to the patient. And it will, in the end, somewhere along the possible diagnosis, will tell the patient that you might have cancer or something like that, to that effect. And then there's a panic mode, and then they come directly to you. And then they have all this, pages of wasted natural resources. I think there is something to be said about the traditional patient-doctor interaction, because symptoms many a time are, not that simple for AI to recognize, because there's a plethora of symptoms may not mean anything. So a good doctor will be able to reassure the patient that there's actually nothing wrong. You don't need any investigations. But what do you see these days? You see that patient is not satisfied with that. They want an MRI, they want this, they want that. So you get under pressure for investigating anyone walking into your clinic. At the same time, we are being criticized for over-investigating. So where do you draw a line here? So I think that's an interesting discussion. Secondly, AI, robotics. I mean, there's amazing leaps and bounds in technology that we are seeing in orthopedics. And as a surgeon, as a robotic joint replacement surgeon, I see a huge advantage in using the technology, but it's not essential. I mean, but I think for the young surgeons, there's no way out. They are in it, they have to use it, they have to learn how to use it, and patient expects that. So yes, AI, robotics is all being used, and I think that's still in its infancy, but I think in future we'll see more and more of this. What about platforms like, the diagnostic platforms, and what about patients' investigations data, MRIs? MRIs are now being read by computers, by AI, and I think most of the time they're more accurate than the average radiologist. But who's regulating that? Who is making these platforms? Who's ultimately responsible if the diagnosis is not correct? All these are searching questions that I think you and I are going to interact over the next half an hour. So I think that is very interesting. Ultimately, I've concluded that I think it's an aid, it's a tool. It's not something that is going to replace an educated physician or a radiologist or a doctor. Sharing of data, we discussed this before, I think in our pre-meeting interaction, that there is no uniformity in various platforms that you see in India, unlike in the NHS, where you have one number, one identity, and any doctor can access your records. Here, every time you go into a hospital or a clinic, they'll say, no, I don't accept that result. You need to get these results done or these investigations done. So there's a lot of wastage of money here. That's because the other platforms don't allow you to access their information because this data is king. They want to retain that data, and also for commercial reasons. So it's very interesting that we need to come to some sort of a conclusion in the national conscious that we need a data set, one platform, or maybe a group of platforms that talk to each other, have a common software that makes them talk to each other. And I think Ayushman Bharat is a step towards that. I think that we are heading towards the right direction. So I think this is what I would like to talk about. Is there anything else you want me to say? I'll be happy to discuss.
That's wonderful, Dr. Uday, and thank you for sticking to the time with surgical precision, if I may say. But throwing a lot of light on what goes on in the doctor's mind. One has always thought about the patient, but I think that's something new, at least for me. So I think let's move now to Dr. Akansha Tani, who's in the IIIT Hyderabad here as an assistant professor. And you've been doing some interesting things, studying politics and ethics of accountability and regulatory practices in the European Union. So can you share your perspectives on these aspects and how, if you have any thoughts on how India compares with that?
I can first talk about why do we need to see health data separately in comparison to the other form of data we have, and we have data protection regulations and everything coming up. So what is unique about the health data that has to be taken into consideration while writing these policies and regulations? What are the critical political and ethical questions that sort of emerges into it? And then briefly tell you globally what's happening, what are the interesting developments that are happening. So first of all, why do we need to see health data separately? In many of the regulations across the world, and in the previous versions of the Data Protection Act in India, health data was seen as a sensitive data, because if the harm, if there's a data breach that happens, the harm and hurt that can be caused through this process may be much higher, because there's, or let's say your sexual identities, or other chronic diseases that you have been facing. If that breach happens, that might cause a significant harm to you. So globally, there has been a concern about looking at it as a sensitive versus non-sensitive data, and can we have the similar policies? India, the present, the version that we have passed of the DPTP Act does not treat it as a separate sensitive data category. Second, unlike the other fields of the digital economy, like for example, music, travel, food, anything that comes into your mind, record keeping and storage has an actual value in healthcare. Okay, so if you have your records from the previous, whatever treatments that have you been taking, that might help you better. And for that, you need, in order to share this data, you need certain standards and interoperability and all of these kind of requirements at the tech level and also at the policy level, so that you can get maximum sort of benefit out of it. As you see in the other fields of the digital economy, the primary, kind of benefit or let's say monetization that comes out is from the targeted advertising. That, okay, I can map what sort of music you have been listening so far, and then, I can sell you the further music, or I can see you have been looking at the travel videos, and I can give you advertisements from the travel companies. That might not actually work in healthcare, and there are significant harm that can be caused in this platform. For example, you'll see in the European Union, there's a discussion that whether your health data can be shared with insurance companies. There is a significant concern that might sort of emerge. So, in this sort of context, we have to see that what are the political and ethical questions that emerge in this whole process. Some of the questions, as the former panelist also highlighted, you really need to identify in the regulations that where is the liability. If something goes wrong, it is with the platform, it is with the user, or with the other stakeholders in the process. And especially in the context where there's a lower digital literacy, how do you make it understand that it is a non-medical advice? It's a medical advice by a non-medical sort of practitioner. How do you make it understand? Like, there's a consent fatigue that is word has come up when you download these apps. There's these longer terms and conditions nobody's reading, because and then you're just giving consent to it. So that is one sort of ethical question that is emerging. Another ethical question that's emerging is the choice architectures of the platform, like the gamification, the whole process of gamification of the health that is done through this platform. That leads to overdoing it. The other sort of concerns that emerge. In fact, we did one study for the healthcare in the metaverse. There was this very strong digital health component that was emerging few years right after COVID that, there will be metaverse, these, AR, VR based, devices based healthcare that will be provided. And we met a lot of startups who were building these platforms. And what we notice is that they do not, I mean, it's essentially being built by the tech people without any, health expert or a policy expert, on board in terms of like what sort of cause and concerns that it can cause. So that is, one issue. Now, very quickly, what is happening at the global policy landscape? Two major, phrases emerging essentially again and again is one is human in the loop, that even if you're using devices and all, because what's happening with the AI-based solution also, there's a major concerns that is emerging, which Chair also highlighted, is the bias. Where the data is being collected and where this data will be deployed in solution, there's a huge gap into it. So let's say if you are collecting data in the fancy hospitals of the metro cities, and then you're taking this solution to the rural areas, there will be, gap in nutrition levels, there will be gap in, other things, and it might not work. Then who sort of, take liability or responsibility, accountability being the keyword of this panel. So that is one concern. So within which, the keywords that are emerging is human in the loop and the institutional oversight that has to be put into place. But specifically to health data, as I said, it has a public good. Like if you have health data of a lot of people, you can bring solutions which can then help a lot of people. So the data altruism, there's one concept that is coming out of European Union in their Data Governance Act, that, how do you build trusted mechanism? How do people voluntarily give their data to a platform which they trust that it will not be misused, it will be anonymized, and the solutions will not be for the private profit but for the all. So yeah, this is what is happening. Thank you.
As far as India is concerned, I just would like to mention we already have a DPDP Act in place, but we don't have the rules formally announced as yet. The second is it's an umbrella legislation, and sectoral legislation is envisaged. So to see the full direction in which we are going, we have to wait for the rules as well as the legislation under the Healthcare Act. To Dr. Avik Sarkar from the Indian School of Business. So they have carried out a very interesting study on actual AI adoption in India. So based on that study, can you tell us what the findings were and what insights you can offer based on that study? And I hope you can also share some of the challenges in ethical AI and some of the important governance models.
So yes, so as Dr. Rentala mentioned, we did a couple of studies over the last 2 years looking at the healthcare AI ecosystem. Particularly, we broke it up into broad 5-6 areas. The first was diagnosis and detection, that was there. Second, the treatment part. And the third part, where we also saw a lot of action happening in India, we call the management of the healthcare ecosystem, which involves hospital management and also involves a lot of this healthcare applications, like say medicine delivery application, which is basically an e-commerce, or say Practo, which is helping you connect. So the ecosystem where you're managing, we are not getting into the core healthcare aspect. So we broadly brought it up into 6 areas. One of the areas where we saw a lot of adoption was in the last one, which was like an others category that we had put into. And then we also saw quite amount of work happening on the diagnosis and detection part. So there is work happening on the diagnosis of, say, breast cancer by Niramai. There is by TB-based detection by Cure, and a range of other startups. So we primarily looked at large companies and startups. There's a lot of work happening in the area of diabetic retinopathy, and I think the major eye care hospitals on the southern part of India are all using computer vision for that purpose. A good amount of work happening in the drug discovery part also. So what we found that on the treatment part, there is a part of robotic surgery that doctor mentioned, but when you're going to recommendations and elements of that nature, I think it was lacking a lot in the Indian sector. So that was one. And also in the geriatric care, we found that very less. That's also maybe because the instruments and the devices are most costly, and human labor is easily applicable or available here. That might be one of the reasons here. Next, we also looked into, so this was one study. The other, we reached out to about 20-25 hospitals, large ones across all over India and tried to understand what was awareness level of AI usage in the healthcare sector. And it was really interesting to see the awareness level for some of the hospitals, maybe I will not take the names, based on the southern part in this city and in Bangalore. They have a very good awareness. Some of the doctors are using AI technologies for their benefit, but then similar size large hospital in other parts of India, they were not even aware that there is a benefit that they can get. So I think that brings us to the point of our large need for awareness. So there is one which are the developers, the startups, the big tech firms which are manufacturing them, and they know the ecosystem, they know what is happening. Second is the awareness with the doctors and the medical staff. It's not just a doctor, because see, you if you are in a hospital, you might interact with the doctor for say 15 minutes in a day, but then rest of the day you might interact with the nurse or the boy maybe 1 hour, 2 hours a day whenever he or she comes to see you. They also need to be aware. If the doctor just tells something and just goes away and the other person is telling a contradicting view, हाँ doctor जो बोला this is not correct, हम लोगों को पता है ये काम नहीं करता है. That normally happens in discussions, na? Because you tend to ask the nurse like what medicine is given, you just double validate it. Do you know this has worked for the last 5 patients that you have seen through? Because doctor will not have the time. This is how the human interactions work. So they also need to have a lot amount. And I think whenever we look at the awareness studies, there is focus only on doctor. The medical staff is completely left behind. Like उनको AI क्या समझ में आएगा. So I think that is a huge amount of awareness required. And the third part we also see is that the patient and the patient parties. Currently they are not aware of what is happening, or they are directed through AI or not. So that is there. In the medical terminology also there is Akanksha talked about the liability part. There is a well-structured liability framework if something goes wrong, like whether the doctor took the proper course of action, the steps were there. If it goes to a legal court case or something, then you will know that better, but I have just read it up and interacted with doctors to understand that. So I am not an expert, I am just telling from my theoretical knowledge. So there are 3 steps where you can identify whether the course of action was taken or not, which is well defined. But something of that nature doesn't exist in the healthcare AI domain. So I think we need to bring in a lot of the checks and balances from the ecosystem, from the government as we go about doing these things. So these were my comments, but I recently found one thing from an AIMS. So the AIMS is using AI for radiology. So there is the AIMS report. I can show you later. So the AIMS Delhi report. And I was really found it very interesting to see the disclaimer at the end of the report. I'll just read it out to you. So you will see that there is a silver lining. This is an Indian startup which is working on it. So they have done an AI-based... Huh? Yes, just quickly I'll read it. So this is the AI-generated reports are preliminary in nature and for the use for clinicians only. So making it very clear and not to be used for standalone or primary diagnostic use. So I think making these very clear is very important. Accordingly, neither the hospital nor the company which is named here expressed have any warranties and checks and balances. But I think having this upfront, telling in a particular report really helps in making very clear that what is happening in the ecosystem. So I'll stop here and maybe take some questions at a later point in time.
So as you can see, we are getting a very 360-degree perspective. And now I will turn to Ms. Shweta Mohandas. I know that the Center for Internet Studies, in which you work, conducts research on AI in healthcare. So can you share some of the key findings of your research and the concerns that they raise? Health AI works on data, algorithms, and infrastructure. So where do we stand in terms of data availability and quality?
My work has been divided. So just before, currently I'm at the Center for Health Equity, Law and Policy. Before that, last November, I was at the Center for Internet and Society. So that's where we had done this year-long report on AI in healthcare. So we spoke to we had a survey and an in-depth interview component. So we spoke to practitioners, researchers, policy people who are working on AI in healthcare, just to see what are the components for AI in healthcare, and also look at the questions of auditability and accountability in AI in healthcare. So one of the things that we spoke to while asked, so we started with the question of data, because obviously we do need The data is the main ingredient that helps in training the AI system. So how prepared is India with regard to Indian data? So it realized that a lot of technology companies that we spoke to, a lot of startups as well, they said that though there is some data with Indian data with regard to Indian health data, the quality is not that good. So you usually go to open data sets that are available from other countries like the US and also even China to get this data set, especially Global North is somewhere where a lot of the technology companies prefer to get their data from, because they said that similar to the NHS, there is a system of collecting data systematically from the beginning, which is, I think, starting new. So though we do have ABDM, it's still in the nascent stages. It's not obviously unified, it's not mandatory, it's still voluntary. So it also depends on how this data is being collected. So quality is another issue. I think one of the examples they stated was something it's more difficult with obviously doctors' notes because the handwritings are different and you want the doctor to, and with the resource constraint, I don't know whether the doctor will have the time to look at the patient or type everything on the computer and get the electronic health records ready. But even with something simple as like images, for example, x-rays and all, they were like maybe the radiologist, by mistake, like we talk about anonymization and privacy, they might just write the patient's name there so the doctor will know which patient it is. So when you kind of put that in the system, it's not anonymized data. Or maybe there are some scratches or there's some pen mark where it shouldn't be. And that doesn't help the AI companies to train it on that data. So they prefer, obviously, better quality data. So even though we have the ABDM system and a lot of data that's being collected, it needs to be of good quality to be beneficial for the AI system to give results as well. Because again, the main thing about AI is to reduce time. So if it kind of is where the doctor has to, again, go back and check if it's correct, if the AI did make a mistake, I think that's another issue that is there with regard to quality. So that's in terms of, say, data quality, in terms of, I think, data quantity as well, the ABDM system is there, but still, I think it needs to be a better system. I think in terms of privacy also, as Akansha mentioned, the final draft of the Data Protection Act kind of has removed this distinction between sensitive personal data and personal data. And initially, health data, there was a definition of it, and there was also in health data under sensitive personal data. So even though there are these ABDM documents or the health data management policies that came during the pandemic, it went with the idea that the Data Protection Act, the then version, defined health data, and health was sensitive personal data. But now that that has happened, there's kind of a disconnect between what the health data management policies consider privacy, or what are the safeguards that are already there, and what the new data protection law brings. So there's always that, there's that disconnect that is there. Hopefully it'll get resolved once the rules come out and there's a bit more conversation. I think one option or one way out, I think, is maybe making health data organizations that collect health data, significant data fiduciaries, so they have a bit more responsibility towards the data protection board and also towards the data principles as well. So that's one option. With maybe AI companies might also be added into that. But again, another question that again comes with regard to defining platforms, defining health data, defining AI companies is also what defines it. Like, for example, there's again clear definitions with regard to what are devices, what are medical devices under medical devices rule. But would, say, the wearable watch be technically a medical device? It's not, but it does collect data. So that's, I think, the conversation about, also maybe our phone is not a medical device, but it does collect a lot of your data, especially if you're filling in data by yourself in terms of what you eat or even your menstrual cycles as well. So it's still collecting data. So how does that work? So yeah, there's a lot of questions about AI, data collection, privacy is also there. Just adding a little bit in terms of auditability, because that report did with that. It's just looking at another way of why we talk about accountability, the questions about liability the doctors are a bit scared about, and AI companies are also scared about that. It's about auditability, figuring out ways in which there's a check and balance before having these AI systems out in the open, or maybe to see where are the questions that are there, the issues about biases. There should be some form of auditing in terms of data, in terms of biases, before these systems are again used in the Indian population. Because again, a lot of these systems might come from infrastructures which are from the global north where things work well, but when you kind of continuously use it in India, or just use it from that framework to India, there are issues like that. Just ending with like an example is one of the easiest examples of biases, or maybe systems not working as intended to how it does in global north is very simple with regard to like voice interfaces or like Siri or Alexa, especially with the Indian accent, you had to explain a lot, or maybe it wouldn't understand, you would always get something wrong. So it's something very easy in terms of like maybe it's not for the Indian accent when it was started initially, maybe it's better now. Maybe there are a few same things with ChatGPT or other voice when you pull it in voice. So I think that's one issue with example with voice, but it gets more severe when it's with regard to health data and regard to, I think, personal sensitive data. I think.
Thank you, Ms. Shweta, for some very crisp and incisive comments. So I think we've really got a wealth of information and insights from these panelists. And let me, as a non-doctor, non-medical, but a little bit of a tech guy, add somewhat different perspectives. And also as an administrator, formerly. When we look at accountability, I think there's a need to define accountability, not only in terms of bias, ethics, and accuracy, but also in terms of ensuring inclusion and access to high quality, affordable, and easily accessible services. At a country level, I think that is also a part of accountability. What is accountability? Accountability to whom? To the people. So there's a need to balance both objectives rather than look exclusively through the prism of safety or security. So also, in my own experience, I believe that India needs to learn from other countries, for sure. But we must find our own path. We must learn to find our own path based on our own conditions and capabilities. We know that we have monumental challenges in healthcare, but fortunately, we are a country which has enormous strengths both in digital and in healthcare. I mean, we have renowned experts in both areas. And it is for this reason that this combination is unique. So we are, unique in some ways. I was at the Global Development Conference 2025 last month in France, where many of these issues were discussed. And I was actually quite astonished by the number of countries that are looking at India as their role model. We must especially consider how do we improve our healthcare system in the entire country without expecting major increases in the government's modest 2% outlay in the budget. Only technology can enable us to do much, much more with the same amount of resources. So coming to data, I think, which has been the common thread in all that has been said, what's critical is ensuring availability of vast standardized data sets for development of health AI, looking at data within India, for research, for innovation, and to enable startups to come up with products and solutions without compromising on privacy. Ownership of the data has to remain with the individual. I think that's something which everyone agrees on. All of these conflicting objectives can be simultaneously achieved with imaginative use of anonymization, encryption, and digital public infrastructure. But we need a suitable regulatory framework which enforces data standards, and if I stick my neck out a little bit, mandates sharing of anonymized data for legitimate purposes. That's the only way we can actually leverage our strengths in terms of data. As far as the bias is concerned, I think we heard where the bias is coming from. So it's important to ensure that AI that is used in India in healthcare is trained on Indian data. But that will only happen if Indian data is available, not if we completely seclude it and guard it so much that it can't be used even for legitimate purposes. On ethics, I think we all recognize that ethics is important. But what is it exactly? I mean, what are the ethical standards that new innovative products should achieve in terms of parameters like accuracy, sensitivity, specificity, as well as in terms of data management standards? I think some good things have happened. The MeitY has set up, sandboxes where this can be done. ICMR has started with the Meditech Mitra, which guides startups through how do you get through navigate all this certification and regulatory process and so on. But I think all of this needs to be put together in a more comprehensive framework. So we need to enable rapid testing of such products, not in the leisurely 3 to 4 years that it can take, But given the pace of technology, this needs to be done in 3 to 6 months. Otherwise, I think we will be left behind both in technology and in businesses. So let me stop here. I'm sure that the questions and further discussions will bring out many more important nuances. I noticed that we are beyond the original scheduled closing time. So I will look at Manisha, who has been fantastic in corralling this whole group and managing us with all the diversity. She's been actually an amazing support to this panel.
Very, very interesting insights. How topics of ethics, responsibility, accountability, how do these differ when we look at tech giants versus startups? Yeah, because I think the expectations are the same, but the handling could be a little tricky, could be a little different. So in your research, do you see this difference on how these important topics are handled between a giant versus a startup?
And so they call them significant data fiduciaries. And in the Digital Services Act and the Digital Market Act, there's a specific list of do's and don'ts for the significant data fiduciaries. For the kind of independent auditing that they have to go through and the other rules and regulations that come into place. What happens with the startup, and let's say and as I said that we did the study on healthcare in metaverse and we went and met the startups and all. When you do not have a specific law in place, there are the other existing laws and policies that come into place, and then how do you interpret that? That becomes more critical. So as we say that in the case of significant data fiduciaries, there is a requirement of having reasonably competent experts when you come up with these solutions and all, which will be sort of missing because you do not have a law in place as of now. So you see that gap sort of emerges in those spaces. But another interesting thing that one has to see, and in the I call it the geopolitics of data and digital technologies. What happens that let's say you have European Union coming up with these stringent laws, which are applicable on the significant data fiduciaries, as they call it, what we call big tech platforms. Now they have to follow those terms and conditions because they are practicing over there, and because they have a global market and they have a reputational cost that sort of comes up with it. So then they start lobbying for the similar stringent sort of kind of frameworks that are also applicable, because otherwise the startups in the other countries which do not have these laws in place, they will have a slightly more advantage. So you also see that sort of pattern sort of emerging. Yeah, that's what I can say.
Would you like to add something?
Okay, thank you.
If you want.
Yeah, I have just one point, just in addition. So I think while there are these questions about, again, big tech has the impact, scale and everything, but doesn't mean the startups should not have these responsibilities, because sometimes it might be a small area where the startup is, but they might be collecting a lot of data, doing really unethical things. So I don't think they should be absolved of it because they're smaller, but there should be obviously checks on both. And again, scale and impact obviously is big for bigger tech, but startups should, I think for innovation, or with the idea of keeping innovation, we should not be like, okay, startups can do anything because they're smaller, they won't affect people. But even if the 5 people they affect, it's still their lives that get affected. So definitely they should still have ethical and responsible and legal obligations.
Very true. And I think that's where policies and regulations come in to make it a level playing field for everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
We also need to keep in mind that the big platforms are global, and regulation is local. And there are a lot of nuances when you try to handle that. I think Akansha brought out, some of the sort of business dynamics which follow. The US leads in innovation. Europe leads in regulation.
Right.
China has its own model, and it's clearly a leader in technology also. But as far as India is concerned, at the top, it has been made very clear, and I think this is some very important takeaway for all of us, which is that the government prioritize innovation over tight regulation. Yes. And I think that is the right model for India. Absolutely. It's not that we don't have any regulation or any security, but you have to find the right balance and prioritizing innovation. I think that's where we are today. Yeah.
The non-techie, non-medical, non-health expert. I'm a sociologist, so I think my questions are about institutions, democratization, and sort of almost to your point about how doctors think about engagement with technology, or how medical workers or staff think about engagement with technology. So I guess a question for all of you. One is exactly that, which is how do ideological orientations of doctors towards tech influence the way that they choose to treat or take a line of treatment, or the extent to which AI technologies are adopted in their practice, as well as within institutional structures.
Yeah.
There was no tech. It was all about patient, clinical examination. And I remember my medical professor, who could resonate a lung, you could hear it in the other end of the room. Now, nobody knows how to do that these days. So many people in India still need those kind of doctors to actually, come up with diagnoses. So I think there's a role for everything. There's a role for technology. There's a role for a doctor in his traditional role. Unfortunately, we're losing that slowly. And what I see of young doctors is that they are very poorly trained. Many medical schools have come up with no reasonable professors teaching them or bringing them up in a proper ethical way. There is no chapter on ethics in medicine. You'll be surprised to know. And I think ultimately wherever there is money, there is loss of ethics, in my opinion. And I think and we've seen that because I have worked a lot in the NHS, I can tell the difference, because you go to America, it's all private. You go to Scandinavia and the UK, it's all NHS. You don't get paid extra for doing extra work. So the whole idea in the NHS is that you spend less and less of government money and work more and more on what your common sense says after examining the patient. Over there, as a patient, you don't have access to a specialist unless you go through a general practitioner who will say, yes, I think you should see a specialist. However, that is changing as well, because more and more private care is coming into these countries. So wherever there is private care, there is complete independence for a patient or a citizen to avoid the intermediary, who's the general practitioner, and go straight to the brain doctor or whoever they think is appropriate for their condition. I think there's so many questions we can discuss. There is no end to it, really. I don't want to take up the whole space, but I don't know whether I'm getting towards the right, going in the right direction.
I think that's a very fundamental question which you referred to, whether commercialization of, healthcare is in principle good. But that's a much, much larger debate, and I think we should perhaps not get into that here. But you haven't reached the stage where doctors have told patients that if you have already consulted Gemini and come to me for a second opinion, please go to ChatGPT. Don't come to me.
I think people have put up boards these days.
Okay. So any other first questioners will get preference. We'll come back if there's time for us. Yes. Yeah, I think there was somebody at the back who had put up your hand earlier. So it
will widen the rural-urban divide, especially with respect to Indian situation.
It's true what you're saying, that in theory, it looks as if all this AI and all that is meant for urban, rich, elite, English-speaking, etc., etc. Assisted access is a big deal in India. And assisted access to literacy weren't even literate, were able to get all the benefits at some nominal cost. What we need to do is to figure out, in the complicated world of healthcare, where there are all the issues that we have talked about, how do you fit those kind of models so that people can get the first response? See, we shouldn't always be thinking about, what is it like in, the kind of hospitals which Dr. Uday works in, or in AIG, or in Apollo. You also have to think of what's happening in the villages. And more than 50% of the cost that people incur in availing of healthcare is out-of-pocket expenses, not in the healthcare itself. So there are a lot of things which AI and healthcare can do in terms of enhancing the extension workers in India. Actually, it can create employment. The same model in e-governance services has created 500,000 assisted access centers with employing 2 million people. Imagine what can happen in healthcare. But that balance is a very critical one, which I think without having any preconceived notions. We need to sit down at a table and work through all these problems and figure out a way.
Question was to do with bias in policy, sort of an angle to the question of bias. For instance, the bias that we carry as developers of AI or people that train AI sometimes gets reflected in the AI itself. To take an example, something like BMI, which was earlier considered like a very standard model, has now been discredited simply because body composition is different for different races. So if concepts like that are applied to AI, or simply, if the kind of data that is collected does not take things like race into account, for example, in cancer diagnosis, because we know that cancer outcomes or the measurement of risk can be different for different races. So how do we sort of tackle the question of bias that creeps into AI, especially in terms of health diagnosis?
So I think it's a very, very interesting question, and there is like no one answer to that. It's very application specific. So if you're looking at, say, diabetic retinopathy, it's a different thing that you have to do versus looking into, say, heart diseases. And it's also each application. So I think I was in an event in Delhi just last week, and when we are actually discussing on this because the AI governance framework has come out from the government, I think the end of last month. We are trying to give one single solution to bias and explainability. But whenever you go to each application, very specific application of healthcare, what that application is doing, the bias and the explainability, the stakeholders, I think all those changes. So it has to be very application specific rather than we are taking a very high level approach. Again, as Akanksha was talking about, we are trying to force fit the European Union recommendation for the rest of the world, which I feel is very high level. We have to go at application level. Once we go at application level, first understand the stakeholders. What is the awareness of the stakeholders? Are they aware, like on what data the system was trained, what sort of population it will be tried on? And then the various risk elements have been taken care of. So I think this is the ecosystem that we have to develop, coming from, say, Ministry of IT, coming up with some recommendations to the individual ministries, and then going even into healthcare, into each specific use case. I think that ecosystem will develop because we are only like scratching the surface at this point. And this calls for a lot of investigation and research on, because it's a very complex system. It's a very complex adaptive system, and we are only looking at, we are trying to very oversimplify this complex ecosystem of the different people and trying to give recommendation and policy recommendations. So we have to go deeper, understand those. There were some sociologists also in the room, understanding the political will of the people. There are economies which want to promote their own startups, and they are sort of going a bit slow on the tech side. Like, say, Biden has passed something on the tech regulations. Trump came in the first month and then nullified that. So again, you have to also see what the political will of that country is in tackling some of those things. So I think these complex things has to be looked into, and we shouldn't at least oversimplify it in the healthcare domain. So that will be my...
I just want to add 2 quick points. One is, I think we need to be very careful about what Dr. Uday had said. The infiltration of commercial interests into these standards or fads of the day. Look at the way Ozempic, for example, is happening. So that is one part of it. The second is, AI is still in its early days as far as healthcare is concerned. But as somebody said, AI in healthcare today is the worst that it will ever be. It will only get better. So with passage of time, I think some of these questions will get addressed. And of course, subject to the relevant data being made available. Everything boils down back to that. Yeah. Finding how to make the data safely but entirely available for these purposes.